This podcast is supported by the Rebecca Vassie Trust, a UK-based charity which promotes the art of narrative photography through granting bursary awards to up-and-coming photographers and funding public education projects like this one. This podcast has full editorial independence, and the views expressed in this series are not necessarily those of the Trust. Welcome to Season 2 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. Today, in episode number 6, we'll be talking with Waleed Shah about breaking stereotypes. Waleed Shah is a photographer, creative thinker, and entrepreneur from the United Arab Emirates. Coming from a background in chemical engineering, he started his career working in the oil industry and slowly discovered his love for photography. His personal projects include Rock Your Ugly, which explores the intersection between physical and mental health, and Magazine Cover, which challenges societal norms. He has had the opportunity to work with industry leaders, talented local and international artists, and a wide range of brands. His photography was recognized by Fujifilm Middle East, and he's an official Fuji X photographer. Could we start by you just telling me a little bit about the kind of work that you do?
Okay, so I wear two hats. I'm not wearing any just now, but I wear two hats. One is as a commercial photographer, and one is a very personal, my own work that's really about society and a lot of mental health and body. I hate the word body positive, but that's kind of what people understand. But there's two paths I take, and they're very, very different, and the conversations are very different. So there's ethics in both sides of them that I have to think about, and they overlap. But I think the knowledge on sort of the client side on commercial stuff, you just kind of have to approach it in a more delicate way because it's your bread and butter. But then on the personal side, you can be very, very open and say, no, I'm not doing this and stuff like that. So yeah, there's very, very two distinct sides. I mean, the commercial stuff is very, let's say, automotive and lifestyle focused. And then the personal side is very society focused. And that sometimes takes on a sarcastic tone as well. So it's also important to be careful with the sarcasm as well.
What do you mean exactly by the sarcastic tone? I'm curious about that.
So I've got this project called Magazine Cover. And it's a series of images that almost makes fun of magazines and makes fun of the beauty industry and just societal norms. And it has a lot of innuendos, and the innuendos can sometimes, a lot of time, be sexual as well. So putting in those innuendos with sort of cultural commentary, you just kind of got to be careful with what innuendo goes with what culture, just so it doesn't backfire and you're not offending the wrong people or the wrong culture, but also kind of staying true to the message if you want to put out a message, but just not completely insulting a culture is also important.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, I guess, as well. If you're sort of using some of those really problematic things to comment on them, and how do you do that in a way that it comes off that you're commenting on it and not just replicating it? Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And you were talking about a little bit there about the sort of maybe constraints on what ethics you can apply when you're working in your more commercial work. And that's interesting because it's something that's come up quite a lot when I've been working with also photojournalists or people who do humanitarian and development photography about this feeling that, there's stuff that we would like to do to be more ethical, but sometimes the commissioning organization isn't willing or able to have that conversation for whatever reason. And I guess, how do you navigate that when you are working sort of for a client, and how do you approach those conversations, or do you?
Yeah, so I always approach it, in a not so subtle way, but not a, if you don't do this, I'm not doing this way, Mm-hmm. So one of the major issues I think we have commercially is representing minorities and cultures in the workplace. So, for example, if there was one time I was doing a commercial for a gas station, and in the UAE, the gas station attendants, or even the general sort of labor or service jobs are Indian, Filipino, that Asian, Southeast Asian community. That's where these jobs are. So it's always troublesome to sort of reinforce that stereotype, So I'm always very aware of what this person looks like when he's doing his job and the placement of this person in the frame, so as to sort of glorify this job, either by putting the person that's a minority at the front of the frame, or having him look like he's having a great time and he looks brand new clothes, looking good, looking happy, rather than he's a tired worker just pumping gas. The other way we would do it is maybe change the nationality of that worker, so it shows that you don't have to be a minority to work in that environment. So it's these things, and I'd approach it in a way where I kind of educate my clients on these conversations that are being had, behind the scenes. So when somebody looks at your campaign from a cultural standpoint, these are the things they would look at, and these are the things they point out. And then they understand, they understand. So when I did explain that, they're like, okay, that's a good point. Let's change that up, and And even for that same commercial, there was also the culture of man and woman and their interactions, where, in a masculine-dominated society, you'll have the man driving and the woman in the passenger seat. So, when I saw that visual, I hadn't seen the visual before shooting, but when I was shooting and I saw them sitting there, I'm like, guys, this is so stereotypical. Let's switch it up. So we switched up the lady, having her in the driver's seat, and it's like a muscle car, and they're having like a light interaction and not a flirty interaction, So it's those societal norms or those stereotypes that you kind of try to break. So it's not just like another lame ad, The same thing went for, I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago. We were doing a commercial it was another car commercial, and it was a video, and it was for Ramadan, which is in the Muslim world the month we fast. And it was the year where Saudi women were allowed to drive for the first time. So, knowing that happened, we switched all the cast for the women to be driving for the Saudi market. And having that knowledge and having that cultural sensitivity really helps with the ad itself.
Yeah, and I guess I think that there's something there's quite an opportunity in doing commercial work, because unlike, documentary photographers have to just photograph it as it is. And maybe you can't subvert stereotypes as readily as you can if you're creating the scene, then you can really play with those expectations and the role reversals and things, I think, in a different way.
Exactly. That's why, when you're talking about documentary photography, I'm so far away from that world. Like, I don't know the first thing about it, and what I understand from an ethical standpoint, what I understand with documentary photography, it's like you want to keep the scene as is. You don't want to touch it, because you're documenting what's happening in reality. You don't want to pose people. You don't want to crop in a way that changes the story. Whereas in commercial photography, you can set up the scene in a way to change perceptions. And that's what's beautiful about it. And I think that's a responsibility that not just the photographer has, but the whole creative team behind that campaign, to educate not just the world, but the client as well. Like, this is what's happening in the world now. We want to break these norms. We want to break these stereotypes. You can be the company because these days, people buy from brands that they associate with culturally as well. So if you're just conforming to what's happening historically, you won't really stand out.
And how do brands sort of take that? Do most of them really take that on board and want to sort of be at the front of changing sort of cultural norms, or have you encountered quite a lot of resistance?
I mean, it's generally resistant, to be very honest. It's generally resistant, but the people themselves, the people working for the brands, understand it. But there's always this expectation that, hey, my boss won't approve it, my boss won't like it. And if only that person was in the room with us, I can talk him into it, you know? So it's just that one layer above that people are always afraid of. And I think it takes a bit of, it takes a bit of courage to stand up to that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you were talking quite a bit there about cultural sensitivity as well. And I guess I'm wondering if you're photographing in a cultural context that you aren't as familiar with, what steps do you take to educate yourself on, how certain campaign is going to be received in that context?
So usually I'd have somebody with me that's part of that culture. So for example, I did a project that was not commercial, that was very personal. I did a project that is called the Father's Day Project, where I took portraits of 9 immigrant workers in Abu Dhabi, in the UAE, and then flew those portraits down to Kerala in India on a motorcycle and went to the villages and delivered those portraits to their families, and then brought the portraits of the families back to the father on Father's Day. So that was a culture that I had no idea about. I had some idea about because 60% of the population in the UAE is from Kerala, but I hadn't lived ingrained in that culture. And that's one of the experiences I wanted from that project. So I took a buddy with me that's from Kerala. His family's there. He grew up there. And he really helped me sort of navigate that culture and also translate and be respectful and stuff like that. So one of the debates we had is that the portraits were in black and white. And he mentioned one time that, when somebody has a black and white portrait of a family member, it means they've passed away. So if you rock up to the house unannounced with a black and white portrait of somebody's father, they're going to think their father passed away in that culture. So to navigate that, we made it clear what we wanted to do. And we would, because I wanted to surprise them. I actually wanted that was my intention in the beginning. But because of that, we decided not to surprise them and just let them know in advance and let the father, call the family and say, these guys are coming. So we announced ourselves before. And then maybe another cultural thing was in Kerala, when somebody invites you over to the house, very, very strange way to do it. But again, I respected it because it's not my culture. When you have a guest at home, they eat first. The guest eats first. By themselves. You know what I mean? They'll serve the food, you sit, you eat, and then when you're done, they'll sit and eat. Okay. And I was just like, dude, this is so weird, But they're like, no. So we were visiting maybe 3 or 4 houses at a time, maybe sometimes it's closer together. So it's very disrespectful if you don't eat. But sometimes you wouldn't be hungry because you just ate at the last family's house. So you just kind of have to pace yourselves and not eat that much at one house if you're gonna be at another house and you have to eat. So it's these little things, and then sort of the amount of time to spend with them, depending on how far you've come, it sort of depends on how much time you should spend at a certain house. So there's a lot of different little different things that I wouldn't have known about. And maybe if I just delivered the portraits, said hello, took some photos and left, that wouldn't have been cool. But having my buddy with me, just sort of translating that culture for me was really helpful.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of those things probably are things that are very experiential and quite hard probably to prepare yourself for or to read about and understand. You almost have to have.
Yeah, I don't think there's any literature that says that.
Yeah.
There's no book you can pick up or an article you can Google. It isn't. You just have to be part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Is there anything, I'm thinking a lot about your practice, particularly with commercial work, but also your personal work. When you first started out in photography, did you sort of start out with this intention that you were going to go and you were going to challenge stereotypes and that was what you were going to do? Or did you have sort of a moment that you realized, what I'm doing feels wrong, or the way that the scene is unfolding or playing out, it's not the way I want to be working?
Yeah, I mean, obviously not. I grew up in a scientific background, so I'm a chemical engineer by degree. And then I slowly moved into the art world. So no, it wasn't that intention. The intention was, it was very much a business decision to go into photography, to live off that instead of a 9 to 5. So no, the intention wasn't that from the very beginning. And I do remember a moment. I remember a moment where I didn't like a scene that was unfolding in front of me, just in my regular life. I didn't have a camera on me. And then I went and told a story about it. I set up a story about it later. And it was one of these. So we were at a pool party, and there's DJ, music, alcohol, bathing suits, everybody's happy, dancing and everything. And then there was this one girl that was slightly conservative. She didn't really want to show off her body, and she had over her bathing suit she had we call it a kaftan, which is just like a robe kind of thing that you would wear at the beach. And she didn't want to take it off. She just felt, I saw it, I saw her walking, and she just felt a little bit uncomfortable taking off the kaftan. So she went into the water with the kaftan. Now the security guard went nuts, blows the whistle at her and get out of the water, you can't do that. And he caused a scene. And the center of attention was this already shy woman that didn't really want to be the center of attention. And she was so embarrassed, So that kind of, I didn't do anything about it at the time. I was just kind of watching it unfold, and it made me feel really, really uncomfortable. I'm like, man, poor girl, So I went off and created this scenario where I put a local Emirati woman in full Emirati gear in a pool. And there was a video, there was a voiceover, there were some photos just telling that story in Arabic. And that really resonated with a lot of people. And that kind of, sent this positive message to the world saying, look, I can wear whatever I want to wear to the beach. What's your problem?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I think that was the moment I realized I'm like, I can use whatever I'm doing commercially. I could use it on a personal level to tell these stories and just to express myself in a way that, more people will listen and maybe change their minds about something.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's such a tough story. It does sort of makes your, I don't know, heart clench, thinking about it, because you can just sort of picture how embarrassing that would be and what a difficult situation that would be. What advice would you give to someone who maybe was interested in going into commercial work, especially in terms of navigating some of those ethical considerations?
A very difficult question. I mean, the advice would change every time you ask me, week to week or month to month. But, when we're talking about ethics, I think it's a strange way to put it, but you actually get famous. You get well known for putting your foot down on certain issues. So, once you put down your foot on one topic, the industry will know about it. And it can go both ways. And sometimes both ways are actually pretty good. So, one way it could go, which is the bad way, where this is a difficult person, let's not work with them. But at that point, I hope your work, your product should be at a level where it's desirable. That even if you're difficult, your work is really good, that, okay, let me see what this guy is capable of. Okay, he's capable. Now, do my values as a brand align with his values? Will this person, he or she, the photographer, give me grief on something I'm going to do? So then, the client would kind of think twice about hiring you. But sometimes it's a good thing, because then, the client would then hire you because you had a stance on something. And I've had that happen multiple times. There's this one client that hired me to shoot some just regular lifestyle images with a car, and I'd never worked with them before. So I always ask them, how do you guys, get in touch? Why do you get in touch with me? They're like, oh, we saw your personal work, which was the magazine covers, which was the sarcasm, and I kind of really like your sense of humor, and I felt you'd bring something to the table that's not just the regular lifestyle. You'd bring some sort of humor to the table. So it does go both ways, but I think the positives outweigh the negatives. So when you do put your foot down on certain issues, then you'll get you'll get recognized for that.
Absolutely. And I guess it means that your clients are sort of self-selecting as well, right? So maybe you'll be confronted with fewer problems that you have to work through with a client, because the client's coming to you know, and are switched on about these things and aware of these things.
Exactly. And they'll be excited to have those conversations with you, because, people, I'm a trained salesman as well, right? In my oil field career. So, one thing we teach everybody is, look, people work with people they like. Your product comes secondary almost to your personality. So if they like your personality and they like working with you on set and you share values and you share interesting conversations, they're more likely to want to be around you more than the other guy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess sort of along similar lines to the last question, I'm wondering if there's any common myth about photography that you'd want to debunk.
I think maybe how long things take. I think, people usually think a photo takes a few seconds or maybe an hour or something. I usually get personal clients saying, hey, can I just come in for half an hour for a few shots? It doesn't work like that. So, part of the process is the sitting down, having the conversation, understanding what you're about, who you are, what your brand's about. That's a big part of the conversation. It's not, hey, just stand there, look cool, click. So, sometimes it is. Sometimes some jobs are like that. But these are, you scroll past these ones.
Yeah.
But the ones that really capture you are the ones that you've spent time understanding what the story should be that you're telling, and that takes time. So, one of my favorite projects I've done that I actually just put out a book about, it's called Rock Your Ugly. And in that project, I interview people for about 2 or 3 hours before we take 2 or 3 photos, and we pick one, and that one image tells the whole story of that 2 or 3 hour conversation that we just had. So it does take longer than you expect.
Absolutely. And I guess, when you were in Kerala, going around to people's houses and things, you're building relationships as well.
Exactly. Yeah. It was, for 9 images, it was 13 days.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think about time as well, because that's something that we talk about a lot, particularly when, I'm doing interviews with photojournalists and documentary photographers, because that's sort of where actually most of the previous podcast guests have all been, mostly been photojournalists and documentary photographers. So it's quite nice to have a perspective more from the commercial side of things. And it's really interesting to hear that, time is also so important when it comes to the commercial aspects.
Yeah.
It's not something maybe I would have realized that not being at all a part of the commercial world, that is so important still.
Yeah, for sure. There's one image I remember it took us maybe 3 days to get that image in because it was just really complicated. Because it's a still image that lives in front of you and you sit and stare at it for a while. It has to have all the elements ready. It's not, I think maybe films might be easier to get away with the quick edits and cuts and making things look cool, but a still image, you have to have really the whole story there. I remember this one image took us about 3 days. It was an image of an airplane refueling. Now, when I say it like that, it sounds pretty simple, right? But the logistics of shooting that and getting the cultural messages in that image took us a long time. So, for example, to get the airport to let us shoot the plane at the airport, obviously, it's easier to shoot a plane at the airport rather than get a plane somewhere else. So, we needed the branding of the local airline to be present. So we needed to time it in a way where I don't like using Photoshop too much. Right, I like to capture something real. So we had to, place it in a way where the plane would land in the background in the right place. That's one thing. The second was, who are the pilots? The pilots were very important. So I was, there's actually behind the scenes video on my website of how we did that. I had a platform raised all the way up to the nose of the plane, and I lit the plane from inside so I can see the pilots clearly, while the jet was refueling from the bottom, and then there's 2 planes landing on the sides. And it's all sort of like this well-timed click, But finding the right pilots, because we could have gotten actors to just fill in as pilots, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to tell the story of this one particular pilot, and it's the first female pilot in the UAE. So I wanted to bring her on her schedule to sit in the right place and have sort of, the right expression. So it was this whole, like, the logistics behind that one image was really complicated. And it took us 3 days. I mean, it took us weeks of planning, but like on the ground work took us about 3 days of work to actually capture that.
Wow. So you have to get her available at her schedule, but you also need the planes landing. Yeah, I can't.
Exactly.
Did you?
And it was COVID time, right? So like the logistics were crazy. The safety procedures, it was a really, really logistical nightmare.
And I guess probably a lot fewer planes were taking off and landing than usual.
Exactly. Yeah. They were taking off and landing at times where the light wasn't right for that angle. And then, they're at that runway, but we can't get this plane on that runway because it's huge,
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
No, that's really interesting. I'll have to, we'll link to that behind the scenes video in the show notes. Yeah. So one question that I want to ask everybody is, what does photography ethics mean to you?
Again, I think it changes, with every conversation, right? And that's one of the reasons I actually don't like having the questions in advance, so I can't really prepare the answers, and I just kind of think off the top of my head. But I think today it's about representing like every culture and breaking every stereotype that you possibly can. And when we're talking about sort of the commercial side of things, again, I don't really know much about the documentary side of photography, but like commercially, like representing the right cultures in an image and breaking the stereotypes of that culture. Because I think, at least in our generation, we're kind of done with our parents' generation of thinking. We want to get rid of that. And it's all about, the male-female roles. It's all about cultural minority roles, breaking those stereotypes and leveling the marketing to include everybody.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. The links to all things mentioned in this episode are available in the show notes at www.photoethics.org. Join me next week when we hear from the other on class in the industry. If you're enjoying this podcast, why don't you check out our online courses? We've developed a series of 3 online courses designed specifically for photojournalists and documentary photographers. We discuss questions like, how do we achieve accuracy in our photographs? What's the relationship between power and consent? And when, if ever, should we intervene? These online courses come with perks, like access to an online community group for discussion and Q&A opportunities with me, the course leader. Enroll today at www.photoethics.thinkific.com or go to www.photoethics.org and click Online Courses. This podcast was edited by Ellie Gascoigne.